Hello there friends and welcome to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and what do we do on this channel? Well, we talk about the hobby, obviously. Sometimes it's about the lore, sometimes it's a retrospect of the hobby itself, the evolution of miniature ranges, sometimes it's a painting tutorial, and even a battle company challenge crops up every so often. So there's something for everyone on this here channel. And today we're talking about something which is quite thorny in the grand scheme of things, and that is the Games Workshop video games, or the tie-in video games to Games Workshop's intellectual property. And I think it's fair to say they've all been very mixed, to say the very least. On the one hand, Dawn of War 1. On the other hand, Dawn of War 3. Don't touch that hand, it's covered in wee. Anyway, if you ask anyone who's been in the hobby for a few years, they will tell you that the video games tend to be very mixed. Some of them are hits, some of them are not, and it really much comes down to a few key things which we'll be talking about in this here video as we do a deeper dive into what happens with these games. And for today's video, we're going to be painting this model right here. Yeah, I know, it's a very lovely model, very real model as well, and I don't actually think it's in any of the video games. It might be in Lost Crusade. But anyway, without further ado, let's talk about some video games and crack on. Alright, let's start off with a little bit of background on Games Workshop's video game legacy. They've been producing video games with its IP since the early 90s. Broadly, these games tend to fall into three very specific categories. Either strategy and grand strategy games, so this is things such as your Talisman games, which also have a board game incidentally enough, your Dawn of Wars, your Marks of Chaoses, your Total Wars, etc, etc. Games which are designed around the strategy, and of course Armageddon. Then of course there's the shooter games, which have been around every so often, so that's mainly your era of your Space Marine, your Necromunda Hired Gun, for example, which is a more recent one, the Fire Warrior, if anyone remembers that very old game as well. And then of course your hack and slashes, such as Vermintide, Vermintide 2, Space Marine Deathwing, which did have a strong range element, I am aware, and a lot of their isometric games, such as Inquisitor. So these are some of the older games that have cropped up over the years. And there are some classics which absolutely everyone remembers, such as the Dawn of War series, Total War series, and some which have been forgotten, such as Space Marine to an extent, Fire Warrior, and of course Mark of Chaos, which we'll get to later. So I think it's important to start off with what works about Games Workshop's IP when it comes to video games. What actually works? Well, for one thing that they've been consistently good at has been world immersion. No matter if you're playing a game which is set in the grimdark or in the old fantasy world, they've always been very good at getting you in the headspace for what those games actually are. You're fully immersed in the grim darkness of the far future where there is only war, or you're very much immersed in the old world of Warhammer when you're in there. When you play things like Necromunda Hired Gun, you very much feel like you're in that world. When you play games like Vermintide or Deathwing, you very much feel like you're in the respective worlds. And that's always been very prominent. However, there have been some drawbacks to that as well, which we'll get to later on. But just to close and summarise on the point of being immersed in the world, because the architecture and visuals of Games Workshop's IP in video games is always so specific, it's very easy to translate one to the other really smoothly. Virtually everything that you see on screen looks like a model or looks like a piece of terrain that you can buy in store, and absolutely every character in many respects is also true to the IP as well, which again we'll get onto more later on. But this does mean that their games are very consistent in visuals, if not necessarily anything else. And this is one thing which is worth mentioning, because if you look at games in other franchises such as the Middle-earth franchise or the Star Wars franchise or the Star Trek franchise, these can vary immensely depending entirely on when they're released, who is making them, and the genre they fall into. But obviously with Games Workshop's IP, you very much are always going to get, in many ways, the same visuals and if not the same tone from game to game, which in many respects works for them. All this to say, they are very faithful to the IP they're given. When Games Workshop works with external developers, they tend to do very well in making sure that the IP is presented in a way they want it to be, and that is a very important thing to mention right now. And we'll get onto that a bit more later on, how it works and how it doesn't work. The next thing to say on the most successful games, with maybe one exception when it comes to Games Workshop's video games, is that they are at their most effective when the player character is the player. And oftentimes you will see this in the strategy games such as Dawn of War 2, the Total War titles, and things like Vermintide and Deathwing, which are a bit more player driven than they are narrative driven. However, this also does have a few other things that are worth mentioning now, is that allows players to be a bit more immersed in the world, as I mentioned earlier. and it means that they are a bit more invested in terms of going on a journey that they themselves are on. And in many respects, this is a bit more on brand for Games Workshop as a whole. The idea that the player makes the story and the story is the player. This is very much the cornerstone of a lot of the narrative campaigns that Games Workshop have created, and a lot of the campaign books that have been pushed in all their games, to make the player feel like they are in command of the story. The story is them and they have the agency. So it does mean that whilst we don't see very many player characters in strategy games anyway, it does mean that in those games where we don't need a player character, that's where they truly shine. However, this also then leads us on to the point in those games which aren't strategy games necessarily, but do still have this effect. A really good example of this is the Vermintide and the Deathwing series. Now, both of these games, and I should say I mean Space Hulk Deathwing, and the important thing to specify in this respect is that both of these games do have quite heavy story elements to them, but only if you want to go and look them up. They are both designed to be multiplayer, which obviously means that the story is more about the players themselves, so this fits in quite nicely into that regard as well. And ultimately, because it has a very heavy online feature to it too, it means that it's meant to be more played with friends and a bit more social than being a particularly story heavy experience, like if you were playing a single player game such as Space Marine or Fire Warrior. But interestingly enough, there have been a few games in the strategy genre which have been a little bit more character-driven. And if anyone remembers around about the time Dawn of War came out, there were a few other games such as Mark of Chaos, and a little bit after that, even Battlefield Gothic arguably had a player character who did speak and have lines. Not very often, but he was there. And also, if we then mention Dawn of War, which we brought up a few times here as well, which is very much remembered fondly by veterans and new players alike, Dawn of War 1 was very much the most story-driven of all of the strategy games, with Gabriel Angelos and his conflicts within and without his own ranks. So whilst there hasn't always been a particularly heavy lean on the story aspect of it, whatever stories there are there, when they work best, are a light presence that the player almost spectates to rather than is directly engaged with or involved with when it comes to Games Workshop's video games. And this brings me on to my next point, that when the story is light, this makes the difference between the games that do well and the ones that don't. As I just said previously, and almost to summarise this point as well, the Games Workshop IP does best when when the player is the one informing and telling the story, not trying to put a story in front of it, because outside of the Black Library novels, a lot of stories in the Warhammer universes, both 40k and fantasy, don't always translate that well into video games, and we'll get to that more in a second. So, to summarise so far, and bringing all the points so far together, it's easy to see why Games Workshop games do their best and what they do best at. They do their best at engaging the player in a story that they themselves are telling. There might be a light narrative that helps everything have a bit more of a sense of progression, but ultimately it's very much the player's actions that decide the outcome of the game, and it's very much designed to revolve around what the player does and what the player chooses to create within the game where it's necessary. In many respects, it does mean that most game worlds are quite reactive to what the players are doing, rather than putting them either in a rigid story that they have to follow, or having to give them characters that they have to influence or win over. Because ultimately, let's be fair here, Games Workshop's IP isn't built off massive character dramas. But before I move on, I do think it's also worth mentioning that there have been a few more character-driven things that have worked quite well. As I said, the lighter story elements in things like Dawn of War 1 and even in Space Marine were fairly competently put together, even if they were very much the same story, and did hold some level of interest, even if the gameplay was meant to be the big draw here. So, to summarise on all the positive points, I think it's fair to say that the immersion and the world building and the character being the player is definitely the strengths which Games Workshop's video games have worked out very well on. Now, there are a few things that Games Workshop's games don't really... I'm going to just call them GW's video games from now on. There are a few things that GW's video games do fall down on, unfortunately. And the first thing that I always find they fall down on is attempts at deeper story. Now, there are a few games I've mentioned throughout, but I'll give very clear examples. In my earlier point, I said that lighter story tends to favour Games Workshop's IP because it means the player is more in control of the narrative, and light stories often add flavour. So that's what you see in things such as the Dawn of War series, the Battlefield Gothic series, and even arguably in the Total War series. Most of the epic battles that are going on are very much the stories that you create, but obviously all these characters have backgrounds, they have a mythos, and they have had a journey, which you do get to take something
which you do somewhat get to take part in, but they are not at the centre of the action. But then there are the games that attempt to have a bit more of a narrative that is front and centre. So that's things such as Fire Warrior and Mark of Chaos, if anyone remembers that game, along with arguably things such as Dawn of War 3. Now, unfortunately, these games that attempt to put the narrative front and centre suddenly struggle with the fact, quite heavily, that Games Workshop's IP doesn't do deep storytelling particularly well. And the reason it doesn't do it very well is because Games Workshop very much presents a grandiose, apocalyptic opera in many respects, where deeper nuanced characters would need time to develop. And unfortunately, since we need to get straight into the high octane action straight away, it's very hard for those characters to translate quickly. I'd actually like to use the example of Geralt from The Witcher. Geralt, you can spend as much time getting to know him and developing his character before you start getting into the pulse-pounding action, and it paces itself quite well. But because Games Workshop's games put the action up front and it stays there for the entire process, you're at odds with trying to create a deeper character and a deeper narrative. And also, to be fair to Games Workshop, sometimes not all of their characters necessarily fit a deeper narrative. Whilst most races do have some nuance to them in both 40k and fantasy, not all of them can have nuance that comes across quickly. One of the biggest ones I find this struggles with is Space Marines. Now, in Space Marine, Captain Titus himself is very much just the player character's avatar. He doesn't say a huge amount that's particularly interesting, and his decisions are very much in line with what you'd expect of your stando heroic Space Marine to do. But whatever conflicts he does have arguably aren't the most compelling or the deepest that I've ever seen in video games. And the thing about Space Marines ultimately is because they are Space Marines, is in many respects they are meant to be removed from humanity. They're not meant to be like us and have the same feelings and conflicts that we have. Whilst this is brought across very nicely in the Black Library novels, and especially in the Horus Heresy, this doesn't always translate particularly well into video games, and potentially it will always struggle to translate particularly well into other mediums outside of the novels, simply because you need to get into the head of a Space Marine. To get into the head of a Space Marine, you have to understand the world that Space Marines inhabit. And this isn't something that's particularly easy to do in a video game without a lot of exposition and a lot of backstory being the entire first act of the game. I'm not saying that you couldn't have a deep story that follows a Space Marine, or a deep story that follows the Orcs, the Tower, or even the Tyranids. But in order to get the player to that point there, they'd have to go through a lot of story before they get to the big pulse-pounding action. And ultimately, when it comes to the Warhammer IP, the pulse-pounding action really is what we're there for. And the other thing I would say as well is that sometimes the faith to the IP can be at the detriment of some of the games as well. I'm going to use Space Marine again because it's actually quite an important example. Everything you see in that third-person shooter is almost directly linked back to models that Games Workshop had available, with a couple of exceptions granted. But the trouble that sometimes creates is that even though they look like the models, you only ever see them as the models. When you see things like Orcs and Chaos Marines running at you in games, you don't necessarily see them as threats, because you know that in real life they are toy soldiers that are a few inches tall and made of plastic. So sometimes this can take away a little bit of the menace, a little bit of the allure, a little bit of the mystique. It feels like the world itself is already well known, it's already presented, and it's hard to create senses of mystery or thrill in Warhammer IP games, and this does fall short sometimes. Dawn of War's greatest letdown was trying to create suspense around the Chaos Space Marines in the first game, where most players who had picked up that game knew who the Chaos Space Marines were, because they knew the universe. So it's hard to do mystery plots with races and species that are very well known to the player already. And ultimately, as a result, when you see the mysteries are revealed, you see the models before you see the threat. You see, in many respects, the artwork, the box cover artwork, and the heavy metal paint team colour schemes before you actually see the threat to you in game. And I think this can occasionally make the game suffer a little bit. The Total War games, I think, managed to sidestep this by firstly having very well animated units on the screen at all times, but also because you're zoomed back far enough from the action, you often see the scale of your opponent's army before you see the individual units within it. And this does help. It gives you a sense of what the danger actually is, simply by the severity and its size, rather than by the individual models that you are seeing on screen. And I use the models, the meaningful digital models and physical models interchangeably. I do apologise. So to conclude, one of the reasons that Games Workshop games can sometimes struggle is that faith to the IP can sometimes mean it's harder to actually lose yourself in the game when you're thinking of the toy soldiers that, yes, you could go and buy, or when it tries to put a story in front of the player that the player may not necessarily feel invested in, and sometimes very much feels like it's just there to tie everything together rather than to add to the video game itself. Now, I know there's long been a conversation when it comes to video games and narrative, what's more important, gameplay or narrative, and I honestly think that with Games Workshop's games, they overall do it fairly well by keeping it as a light presence, rather than trying to make it a particularly story-rich experience, because ultimately, that's not really what this IP is for. So, to conclude, Games Workshop games really do their best when the IP is made to fit the video game, and not the other way around. And it's very easy to see sometimes when you can see the video game having to strain a little bit at the edges to try and fit the IP in. Dawn of War 3, Mark of Chaos, and arguably even Space Marine are all good examples of this in the recent memory, whereas games such as Talisman, Regicide don't have this so much. They have more simplified game mechanics, which obviously means that the IP is more prominent in many respects, which means that you're asking the question, was the game made to fit the IP, or was the IP complementing to the gameplay experience? It's very hard to know. But as I say, I think getting the two of them to work together is not as big of a challenge as some game developers and some people would believe. I think it's just a question of knowing where the IP fits best and what kind of games it fits best in. And ultimately, I'd always say that it comes back to games that are both immersive but also more player driven than trying to find characters within those universes that you can simply start with. Fresh characters in video games have been quite rare. In fact, I believe the Dawn of War series have been the only one to ever create characters specifically for the video games that have eventually translated into the main game for the tabletop, but it doesn't happen anywhere else. Largely it's been the other way, which is understandable, but ultimately this does then lead to the question as to what will the future of Games Workshop's video games look like? Well, we don't have to speculate that much, because in the recent years we've started to see Games Workshop broaden into a lot of what we would consider the AAA club. We've seen them do things such as the Total War games, which are very much has brought their ship home with the Warhammer franchise, and is also acting as something as a swan song for the old fantasy players to get lost in the old world, or the world that was. We've seen games such as Lost Crusade, which is a freemium mobile game, which is almost on the level of Raid Shadow Legends in some people's minds, allegedly anyway. And then of course we've seen other things such as Dakajet and Inquisitor Hired Gun, which emulate flight sim, and even things like Doom in many respects as well, which does show that Games Workshop is at least letting their IP be used in more appropriate areas, even if it does still feel very much like they're on the back foot when it comes to games. But what other games do you reckon we'll see in the future? Will we see a 40k game that is similar to Dark Souls? Will we see an Age of Sigmar game that's either grand strategy or a hack and slash? There's a lot of scope for video games in the Games Workshop IP, but I suppose the question always is that what's going to be more important, the gameplay experience or presenting the IP? I'll leave you guys to figure that out and decide amongst yourselves. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I look forward to hearing from you. So those are my thoughts as to why Games Workshop's video games and tie-in video games are always a bit hit and miss, and I want to hear what you guys think in the comments below. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, all that good YouTube chilly stuff. And whilst you're down there doing all those wonderful things, check out my website to see the services I provide, as well as my Patreon. And if you just want to see some pictures of toy soldiers, then just have a little look at my Instagram. New videos on Wednesdays and Fridays, but thank you all very much for joining us today. Goodbye, and have a lovely day.